Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh, everyone. Welcome to another week of our book reading with Professor Khairudin Aljunied. Alhamdulillah, we have reached the second last chapter, and it's also the longest chapter, Prof. And this chapter will be on Keadilan. So for those who are in person and online, Prof, what page is on yours?
Mine is on page 312.
Page 312 on the latest edition on Keadilan, and Prof, you can take it away. Bismillah.
Okay, Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. We have gone through so many chapters already with HAMKA, and I think this chapter is almost like a culmination or the peak of all of the points that HAMKA has discussed throughout the book. And in this chapter, he brings us to looking at a big issue actually in Islam, the issue of justice, or in Malay we call it keadilan. Now, before I discuss HAMKA, I just want to discuss first what people who are outside Islam, the non-Muslims, or yet to be Muslims, as we call it, Ghairul Muslim means yet to be Muslims, say about Islam in relation to justice. If you read the works of this historian, his name is Malis Rufban, and he has this book where he talks about the history of Islam. He says as follows. He says, if one could sum up in a phrase the essential difference between two great Western monotheisms, one might say that whereas Christianity is primarily a religion of love, Islam is above all a religion of justice. So the point is quite clear here, that what he's trying to say is that in Islam, the most important thing is keadilan, justice. Justice precedes everything else, and that's why in the Quran Allah say a'dilu huwa aqrabu taqwa. So be just, because justice is above everything else. And HAMKA makes this point very clear in the very beginning. In page 312 he says, keadilan amat luas dan banyak lagi keutamaan lain yang bergantung kepadanya, seperti berbuat baik kepada orang, tulus dan ikhlas, membela kemanusiaan, mencintai tanah air, menjaga pekerti, dermawan, dan menjaga hak kesamaan. So when we talk about keadilan, we are talking about something very, very wide that includes everything that we do in life. Keadilan kepada diri sendiri, to be just to yourself, to be just to the people around you, to be just to your environment, to be just to the society that you are in, to be just to everything that you are interacting with. So I want to begin with that first, and I just want to say, when we talk about justice, we need to first be clear what the concept actually means. So Hamid, if I ask you what justice means, what would be your understanding?
Justice. I think maybe in the hierarchy of things that are important in Islam, maybe we have to give each thing its due, you know, to help people maintain all the freedoms that a normal human being should have.
Okay, so very beautiful. Yeah. So justice, as Hamid was saying, is about putting something in its rightful place. Iaitu, if you say in Malay, keadilan adalah meletakkan sesuatu di tempatnya atau di tempat yang sesuai untuknya. So that's one understanding of justice. But on the same page, page 312, HAMKA defines justice in the last paragraph. Apa erti keadilan? Kalau diambil erti kata sahaja, iaitu tegak di tengah. So go back to the chapter on moderation. To be just is to always be in the center of everything. To not be extreme, nor to be lax. To not be too active, nor to be passive. To not eat too much, or to eat too little. To not interact too much or interact too little. Falsafah Nasrani, and here he draws actually from Christianity, mengajar erti keadilan ialah jangan lakukan kepada orang lain sesuatu yang kita tidak senang kalau dilakukan kepada kita. So very simple definition that he is given about what justice is. Justice is basically don't do to people what you do not desire for yourself. And Rasulullah SAW has a very beautiful hadith in the 40 hadith of Imam Nawawi, and I will encourage everybody to memorize this hadith. La yu'minu ahadukum hatta yuhibba li akhihi ma yuhibba li nafsi. One does not have faith until one loves one's brother more than oneself. So if you love someone, that is already a manifestation of justice. And if you love someone more than you love yourself, that is the highest form of justice. It's about, for people who are married and who are listening in, who are married, we are encouraged to love our family as much as we can and to shower them with as much protection as possible. And in doing so, we actually exercise justice on them.
Yes. Yeah. Yes. Thank you, Prof. And continuing from Prof's reading of the opening few paragraphs, Prof, maybe we can just read together. So in the first few paragraphs, he covers certain principles that we need to pay attention to in achieving justice. So he goes on about persamaan, equality, kemerdekaan, certain freedoms, and hak milik, people's rights. And then Prof mentioned families. So here he goes into bringing this discussion of justice into our day-to-day lives. And then he says, Prof, you can just read. Menghormati kehidupan manusia itu adalah tujuan yang terutama dari hukum keadilan. So he's tying it back to just the humanity that we should have. And then he says, kerana segenap kehidupan itu ada manfaatnya kepada masyarakat ramai, meskipun kehidupan seorang tukang sapu jalan sekalipun. Sebab di belakang tugas sapu jalan itu berdiri anak-anak dan bininya yang menggantungkan pengharapan kepadanya. Dan meskipun dia orang tunggal, tidak berfamili, hidupnya pun dapat perlindungan dari masyarakat dan undang-undang. Maka membunuh orang lain atau membunuh diri dipandang sebesar-besar dosa pada pandangan agama dan dirinya, haruslah lekas orang itu ditolong dan diobati. And then Prof mentioned this before in a previous session on the injustice that comes with killing yourself, with suicide. Yeah. So
So if I can take from that, there are 3 points there that he's trying to emphasize when it comes to understanding the Islamic concept of justice. The first point is that in the worldview of Islam, nobody is below anybody else. Persamaan. Everybody is equal. Whether the person is working as a laborer, whether the person is a king, whether the person is a professor or a student, or working as a policeman, or working as, even he say, menyapu sampah, all of them are equal in the eyes of human beings and Allah. The only differentiating factor is the level of taqwa. In fact, and I think I said before in an earlier session, for Imam Al-Ghazali, and he said it in a very profound way, he says that the iman of all women, he used the analogy of all women, is higher than the iman of the ulama of his time. Why did he say it? He says that these old women, they have more taqwa towards Allah than the ulama. So the idea of equality, everybody is equal in the eyes of Allah. But the other more important point here that I think Hamid is trying to highlight is the idea of being free, kemerdekaan. Free from the clutches of society, free from the clutches of the expectations of the world, and free from being subjected to the oppression of other people. And that's why he talks about orang yang membunuh diri, people who kill themselves. One of the reasons why people decide to end their lives is because they are in despair and in this disappointment of the expectations towards themselves and the expectations of others. There is a very beautiful quote by this French philosopher, and his name is Jean-Jacques Rousseau. And Jean-Jacques Rousseau said it very nicely. He says, all men, all human beings, he says, are born free, but everywhere they are in chains. Especially people who live in highly developed countries. They may seem to be free to us, but they still owe money with HDB. That's one. They have mortgages to clear, and they burden themselves with things that they don't need. So what is to practice justice? It is to free yourself from things that you do not need. Now, he talks about hak milik as well, where he says that everybody has the right to own things, and in a society where people are not free, hence treated unjustly, they actually are not allowed to own something of their own. That's why if you want to know whether you are in a free society, is the easy barometer of that is whether you live your life free from anxiety. And in many developed countries, even though people live in beautiful places, beautiful houses, people are not free. People are always afraid. I have friends who live in big houses, drive fancy cars, but they are always in a state of worry. And this state of worry is an unjust thing that one has done to themselves. Like Rousseau said, they are in chains. And it is our duty now to actually free ourselves from all of these things. Can we do it? Yes and no. And I think it is actually a matter of choice. The Quran says very, very powerfully, Man ihtada fa innama yahtadi li nafsi wa man dalla fa innama yadillu alaiha. Whoever goes aright, he goes aright for himself. Whoever goes wrong, he goes wrong for himself. The problem that we have in our time is that we always do not make choices for ourselves. And this is actually the challenge of human beings. You don't decide for yourself. You let society decide for you. You let the majority decide for you. You let the systems decide for you. In the end, you cannot achieve something for yourself. And he's trying to emphasize on this point.
Thank you so much, Prof. And Prof, maybe I can just pose to you another discussion on that came to my mind when I was discussing this. When Hamka is discussing justice here, he's trying to do it in a way where he uses universal language. So he's talking about equality, about freedoms, and then that brings us to the question of religion also being a cause of injustice.
Right.
And after reading a few paragraphs from here, I picked up the book by Habib Ali Al-Jifri, Humanity Before Religiosity. And then that's also a question. Is sometimes religiosity also a cause of injustice when the sanctity of human life is placed below certain customs or certain religious traditions? Then it reminded me of another hadith that I heard from the former Mufti. A beautiful hadith. This was during the time of COVID, narrated by Abdullah ibn Umar, where he says, I saw the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam circling around the Kaaba and saying, how pure you are and how pure is your fragrance. How great you are and how great is your sanctity. But by the one in whose hand is the soul of Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, the sanctity of the believer is greater to Allah than your sanctity of the Kaaba, in his wealth, in his life, and to assume nothing of him but good. So, yeah, Prof, any thoughts on religiosity?
So now I think there is a movement. I was just talking to my class. I was just sharing with my class yesterday about this. There is a movement in the West now. They call themselves as the New Atheism by Richard Dawkins and others. And they make this argument. It's actually an old argument. In the earlier years of secularization, they are saying that all religions, especially Islam, subject people to regimes of oppression. Basically saying that Islam is an unjust religion. Islam subjugates women. Islam imposes certain practices that make it difficult for human beings to live as free human beings. Now the irony, there's another brother, Hamza Zorgis, I cannot pronounce his second name. He argued against Richard Dawkins on this. And Hamka also makes the same point, that the idea that religion actually imposes unjust rules, conventions, and also practices on human beings is not because of the problem of the religion itself. It is actually the problem of the people who enforce the religion. And it's always the case, and we talked about this in the earlier session, where either the ulama or the imams or the state uses religion as a tool to subject people to certain things that take away their freedom. In essence, Islam celebrates the freedom of all human beings, and we'll talk about this later on. I don't want to talk about this first, but the idea of freedom has to be defined properly first, and I will talk about this later. But more importantly, Hamka also says that in order for religion or for our lives to be, in a sense, fully attuned to being just, we must also allow ourselves to follow certain rules and norms. So he says in page 319, on the second paragraph, he says, keadilan menjaga nasib manusia. Menurut pandangan hukum keadilan, tidaklah adil apabila orang yang banyak wang mempergunakan tenaga si miskin, atau orang yang pintar, he's talking about the ulama, memperkuda tenaga si bodoh buat keperluan diri sendiri. Itu hanya memperbaiki kedudukan diri sendiri, kedudukan dirinya, bukan memperbaiki masyarakat. He's basically telling us it's like a double argument here. He's basically trying to say that everybody, no matter whether they are powerful or they are not powerful, must follow certain hukum, certain laws. What is that law? The law of justice. What is the law of justice? The law of justice means that you are always responsible to the people around you, especially if you are endowed with something, be it intelligence, be it wealth, and so forth and so forth. But there are conditions where injustices happen, right? Society becomes unjust. So what do we do now? How do we fix injustice? And this is where Hamka interestingly talks about the French Revolution on page 316, and then he talks about certain laws that needs to be imposed. He even talks about the law of ta'zir or hudud, of potong tangan. He says that, you know, if someone steals from society millions and millions of dollars, you ought to actually cut their hands. The reason is because a thief who steals $30, they get jailed for 3 years. Someone who steals $3 million, they also get jailed for 3 years. There is no equality to it, because the person who stole $3 million, he does more harm than the person who steals $30. So he says what we should do now is to enforce a certain kind of law to ensure that justice is practiced the same for all. And sometimes he says we need to go to war against injustice. Now, when people read this, people will misunderstand Hamka. People will say, especially in page 317, he says, perang pun kadang-kadang terpaksa dilakukan, on the second paragraph, kerana mempertahankan hak atau menyelesaikan sengketa suatu hak rakyat yang tidak dapat diselesaikan lagi kalau tidak dengan senjata. It seems like Hamka is actually advocating war, but Hamka is not actually advocating war. What he's trying to say is that in situations where injustice is at the level of intolerable conditions, where people are subjected to being almost like slaves, and when the systems become essentially inhuman, war would eventually happen. Now, I want to talk a little bit about this, Hamid.
Yes, Prof.
And the reason is because when people read such lines, many of our young people say, okay, let's go to war. Right? So there's this misunderstanding of what he's actually trying to say.
Yes.
But first, I want to recommend a book that everybody read. And the book is by Majid Kaduri. He's a Syrian, I think, scholar, who the title of the book is War and Peace in Islam.
Oh, okay.
Right? And he talks about why war is an integral part of Islamic history. But the larger bulk of Islamic history is peace. And that's why justice is best enforced in periods of peace. Now, why I want to talk about this is for the listeners to understand, especially young people who sometimes are susceptible to certain ideologies and ways of thinking, that in Islam, war is to be avoided at all costs, even if one is trying to uphold justice.
Yes.
War and violence are the last act that one should take. The rule of thumb is that peace is the highest form of justice, and even if war happens, and this is the thing, to me, the beautiful thing about Islam, the rules of war in Islam is so stringent that it's better not to go to war, especially amongst the Malays. Have you all noticed that all martial arts in the world, just a side thing, is related to the topic on justice. All martial arts in the world, whether it's taekwondo, karate, judo, whatever that you can find, they are very offensive arts. That means if you go on a taekwondo match, you will kick first. Let's not talk about MMA. MMA is all about offensive.
Yeah.
But if you look at Malay Silat, what does the Silat person do?
Sini.
What?
Sini.
Before they fight, before the two Silat experts fight, they will do the hand movements, they will face each other, they will stare at each other, then they fight. What does that show? Melayu macam lambat sikit. It shows that Malays have a high or very advanced conception of justice. That Now we are in conflict with each other, and kita dah buka kuda-kuda dia. But if possible, let's not fight. And that's why bila diorang bergaduh, bila mereka bersilat, before they even fight each other, there will still be conversation. Semua like a Hindi movie, you know. There'll be speech among each other. Nanti aku akan pecahkan kepala kau. Okay, lebih baik kita jangan gaduh. And this is actually the beautiful thing about the Malay world. If you look at conflicts all over the world, there are studies of wars all over the world. The Malay world is a place where wars are the minimum in the history of human beings, because Malays understand the concept of justice and the idea of war. That if you want to use war to uphold justice, it ought to be the last resort. And I just want to explain this because some people may misunderstand this issue. And the Quran also emphasizes this. The Quran says that man qatala nafsan bi ghairi nafsin aw fasadin fil ard faka'annama qatalan nas jami'a. The Quran says that whoever takes a life unless for punishment for murder or mischief in the land, it will be as if he has killed the whole of mankind. So basically the Quran disallow us to engage in war unless war is necessary.
Yes, yes. And what Prof just mentioned, Hamka also covers it in a more low-key way. In the beginning of the chapter, he talks about how revenge is from the age of ignorance. So yeah, I think he talked about Bani Abbas, Bani Umayyah, and how their the culture of revenge war is from the Jahiliyah. So that's Hamka on the wars. And then he continues, Prof. He talks about modern warfare, and then he says tetapi perang moden sayangnya tidak lagi menghormati aturan itu. Perang sekarang adalah perang total. Penduduk yang tidak ikut berperang lebih banyak menjadi korban dan mengerahkan tenaganya untuk kerja paksa, padahal perang sudah selesai. So the aftermath of modern war is far more devastating compared to the war of the past where there's more ethics. So even in if we're going to talk about war, the modern time is just not the space for it lah.
Yes, but there's something worse than war. And this is the interesting part about this chapter. There's something worse than war that affects justice amongst men. And the worst thing than war is fitna. And he talks about this. How the newspapers, the media of his time causes fitna in the society. And we all know this. In our society, here in Southeast Asia, fitna is in our DNA. Right? We meet each other, keji mengkeji, cerita mencerita. This is a big thing, and he talks about this. He says that in page 320, membuat fitnah kiri kanan adalah berlawanan dengan roh adab sopan santun. Orang yang bekerja, he says that there are some people, their job, their everyday job is to transgress justice by spreading bad news about other people. Orang yang bekerja demikian tidak dapat dimasukkan ke barisan orang yang beradab. Kalau dia seorang yang beradab, dia harus berani bicara terus terang, tidak bicara di belakang dengan maksud memperbaikinya. So again, I think this is, if there's one thing that we can learn from this chapter on justice, is that we need to stop this culture within our community of pertama cakap belakang orang. Don't backbite people. You want to front bite, it's okay. If you don't like something about someone, you tell the person, I don't like what you're doing, please change. That's number one. Number two, don't say something about people that you have no clear information about or secondary information about. Aku dengar dia ni baru kahwin lagi. Right? This is the usual tabloid story. And we then spread the news around. I heard that the person did this, did that. All of this actually affects justice, especially within family. If there's one thing that has destroyed Muslim families, especially in Southeast Asia, it is fitna. Right? And this is a big issue that we need to address head on, because this whole idea, aku dengar orang cakap, is a kind of sickness that has entered into our community. Right? Dengar orang cakap tapi tak tahu betul tak dia cakap, tapi kita terima apa yang dia katakan, and we need to change things.
Yes, Prof. Yeah, and I just want to extend from what Prof just said, and then we can go into the discussion here on the freedom to state your own opinion. So here, Prof, here Hamka is talking about how those who spread fitnah are actually the ones who don't have freedom of opinion. because they don't have the adab and the knowledge of how to state their opinion without going against social norms and without hurting others. So he says, one of the things one of the signs of you stating your opinion successfully is that sebab kemerdekaan telah dipergunakannya untuk merosakkan kemerdekaan orang dan membinasakan ketenteraman umum. So when we are stating our opinion, we cannot transgress upon the freedoms of others, and also have a negative impact on the tranquility of the people around you. So that's a good guideline.
It's a good guideline, and also he's making a point about freedom, right? You can hear people saying, aku cakap lah apa aku nak cakap. Mulut aku ke? You always hear people saying this. I have the right to say whatever I want. In Islam, there's no such thing. There's no such thing as what we call as al-hurriyatul mutlaq. There's no absolute freedom in Islam. The idea that I can do whatever I like at any given moment in time doesn't exist in Islam. The idea that I can say whatever I like in the manner in which I like it doesn't exist in Islam.
Yes.
In Islam, freedom must always be subjected to certain ideas of societal peace, number one, but also the awareness that Allah is always watching. So another book I want to recommend, and this is by Hashim Kamali. Hashim Kamali wrote this interesting book called The Freedom of Expression in Islam, where he explains that Islam allows everybody to say anything, but saying anything doesn't mean that you can say something that is detrimental to the welfare of the larger society. So again, we use the word maslahah. Whatever that we want to say, whatever that we want to express, especially in the social media, we must also look at the impact on society. Of course, we can never measure how society is going to react, but we must first be sensitive of what are the impact of certain things that we say upon the people around us, especially when it comes to the sanctity of human life, the integrity of a certain person, the dignity of a given personality in society, and more importantly, how people will actually respond in relation to their relationships with other people. Because some things that people say, and I've been in certain countries where people are very, very opinionated. I lived in the US, where everybody can say everything. It has resulted to a lot of negative consequences on society, and HAMKA talks about this. Now, then that brings the idea of kebebasan berfikir, right? Again, Islam actually emphasizes on the importance of us thinking deeply over things. In order for us to achieve justice in terms of expression and thought, we must develop this so-called mode of thinking that HAMKA calls ijtihad. So on page 323, he says, pintu kebebasan menyatakan fikiran itu terbuka luas dalam agama Islam, iaitu kebebasan berijtihad atau ijtihad. Kemajuan ilmu usul fikah, ilmu tafsir, tasawuf dan lain-lain dalam Islam adalah berpangkal daripada terbukanya pintu ijtihad. So what is ijtihad? Ijtihad basically means to exert your mind in order to open up vistas of knowledge, to exert your mind to such an extent that you can understand things in greater depth. So it's not about only thinking, right? It is about thinking deeply with comprehensive knowledge. And this is something that we need to inculcate amongst the young, right? It's not about you expressing your thought because you know something, but you express yourself until you only express yourself until and unless you have a clear picture of the issue at hand, and then put out your opinion in a way that is informed. We have a lot of things on social media now where people say things when they only know half-truths. And again, we have talked about this before. Half-truths are more dangerous than complete truths. In fact, half-truths are more dangerous than lies. Sometimes lies are less dangerous than half-truths because half-truths appear believable, right? And we need to be very, very wary of things that you see in the media today on this.
Yes, yes. And bro, one more thing, maybe to engage the youth on the art of argumentation is the phenomenon of vulgarities, vulgar language, vulgar speech, seen as something that is cool. Another problem amongst the youth lah. And then, Prof, maybe we can continue on into Hamka's discussion on the freedom of religion, the freedom to practice religion. So here he said something interesting. He said, untuk menilai betapa pentingnya agama ini sebagai hak asasi manusia dan juga sebagai salah satu tiang dari demokrasi dan dasar daripada hukum keadilan, haruslah kita ketahui bahawasanya kepercayaan akan adanya kekuasaan ghaib adalah fitrah daripada jiwa manusia sejak dari manusia primitif sampai kepada manusia yang semaju-majunya. So here he's actually saying religion is a pillar of democracy. Any idea what's that about?
Yeah, so it's interesting. In the later part of the chapter, he also talks about this. What is the place of religion in modern day democracy? Does religion has a place within the current states that we have? And he's basically making the argument that all states actually require religion, because states that have been totally so-called secular, such as the communist states during his time, they have proven to be very, very oppressive. And what religion does in the state is not to impose a system that is artificial in the lives of men. He's trying to say that religion, when they are put together in governance, actually help to give moral values into society. Now he makes this other interesting argument that even people who reject religion are actually religious if they are just to themselves, and it's a very philosophical thing. And I discussed this again in my class. I said that one cannot be secular unless one reject religion, correct? You can only be secular when you say I don't agree with religion. But in rejecting religion, you actually acknowledge that religion is there, right? In acknowledging that religion is there, that means you, even as a secularist, do know that there is some kind of higher power, higher order that people in general are subscribing to. Which means that any country that rejects religion is a country that cannot function properly. And this is his big point. And he actually drawing it from the Quran. If you read Surah Luqman, and it's very beautiful in Surah Luqman, ayat number 25, where Allah says, "Wala in sa'altahum man khalaqas samawati wal ard la yaqulunna Allah qul alhamdulillah bal aktharuhum la ya'lamun." He says that if you ask, and Allah is talking basically about the disbelievers, and amongst these disbelievers are the people who are called ahlul dahr, people who believe in time. They don't believe in God, they believe that time is God, right? If you ask all of these people who don't believe in God, who don't believe in religion, who is your Lord? The Quran says, they know that their Lord is actually Allah. What is the Quran trying to tell us here in relation to what Hamka is trying to say? He says on page 327 that at the end of the day, tadi telah kita katakan bahawa bangsa-bangsa tadi yang masih primitif mengangkat yang tertua yang paling berpengaruh antara mereka menjadi pemimpin agama. Tetapi naluri atau insting manusia itu sendiri, kalau tidak mendapat pimpinan, akan mendorong manusia untuk mengabaikan fitrahnya, lalu mereka berasa bahawa mereka lah Tuhan. He says that even in primitive societies where people do not accept religion, they will end up making themselves gods, which is trying to tell us that every human being, whether they acknowledge it or not, whether they are just or not just to themselves, are predisposed to religiosity. That's why even the person who does not accept any religion, when something happens to that person, and I said it before, they will say, "Oh my God." Oh my God. And this is normal, right? If you ask anyone who doesn't believe in religion, what happened, and I just want to share with you, I just read the biography of this great Palestinian scholar that I love so much. His name is Edward Said, right? Edward Said is ultra secularist. He doesn't believe in the place of religion in his life, even though he was born a Christian. Right? The title of the book is Places of Mind by his student called Timothy Brennan. Now, at the end of his life, he got cancer, and before he died, this biographer said he was already starting to be attuned back to his old religion, which is Christianity. Then he died, right? This secularist, famous secularist, he wanted to be buried in a cemetery. He lived in the US for 50 years in Lebanon, and the cemetery is a Quaker. Quaker is one branch of Christianity, and his body is laid in a Christian cemetery. This guy was saying that where he is buried, in relation to him being a secularist, the place is just not quite right. See, but it's actually the right place to be. What I'm saying is that at the end of the day, it is in our fitrah as human beings, if we are just, to recognize that God has a place in our lives, and religion has a place in our lives.
Yeah, Prof, and correct me if I'm wrong, but Hamka covers this very, very comprehensively in his Falsafah Ketuhanan. That's one of my favorite books of Hamka. If anyone is interested in that book, in 2 or 3 pages, he goes through the whole, a very nice, succinct history of how humans came to God. So they started by worshipping the mountains, and then when the sun gave them crops, and then they worshipped the sun, and then it transitioned into, and then he said it transitioned into the modern day. Humans are starting to worship themselves, and then he quoted the ayat from the Quran. But if they were to try to create a fly, they wouldn't be even be able to do that. So. Hamka is a master at philosophy of religion.
I just want to go further on that point, because there was a report that just came out yesterday, and I was just sharing it to my friends, and you can check it online. The title of the report is "Religious Revival: Why Young People Around the World Are Finding Faith Again." Right, and the author is basically trying to say that more and more young people are getting religious than ever before, and Hamka anticipated this during his time in the 1960s, that it won't be long before secularism loses its steam. And now religion is coming back because people want to fill up the vacuum in their hearts. They realize that they have been unjust to themselves for forgetting God, and God is coming back. Again, I want to recommend another book that everybody read, and this is by a German scholar. His name is Jürgen Habermas, very famous. I disagree with him when it comes to his stand on Israel. He's a supporter of the Zionist regime, but I totally agree with him when he talks about what he calls as the post-secular age. So the title of the book by Jürgen Habermas is "An Awareness of What is Missing: Faith and Reason in a Post-Secular Age." Now, what's interesting is the term that he used that now has become a talk of the town in social sciences. He calls our time now as the post-secular age, which means that people are no longer accepting secularism or secularity as an organizing framework of their lives. They now want a life where spirituality plays a bigger role, because it is in human beings that the idea of the spiritual has to have a place in their daily life. So maybe we can take a look at this book, and perhaps we can have a session, to discuss about what does this post-secularism actually mean.
Yeah, Prof. And just extending from that, Prof. I don't know, maybe you want to skip this part, but he goes a bit into the history of how we came to a secular world in the first place, when the state separated from the church. And then maybe I just read, there's this famous quote that you often hear, professors on this subject quote, berikanlah, and this is in Malay, the first time I read it in Malay, berikanlah hak Kaisar kepada Kaisar, dan berikanlah hak Allah kepada Allah. So this is the quote by the Christians where they say, give unto Caesar what belongs to Caesar, and give unto God what belongs to God. So pursue the world. So I think Caesar is the world. Pursue the world in one frame of mind, and then give to God what belongs to Him in another compartmentalized part of your life. So I don't know, Prof, you want to cover this a bit?
Yeah, so that begs the question now. Hamka is basically trying to say that Islam has a big role to play in governance. Islam has a big role in the organization of the lives of all, be it Muslims or non-Muslims. But we live in a country where that is not the reality. So what do we do now? Right? So what do we do? A lot of people will say, migrate to a Muslim country. That's one approach that people take. But Hamka is far more sophisticated than that. He's saying that yes, the ideal is to have a system where Islam becomes the organizing framework. But if the system is not there, what you need to do is to find Islam in places where you can actually practice your religion. And that place is actually your homes. So on page 339, he says that, or the last paragraph, he says, berdirinya negara menurut pelajaran agama Islam adalah untuk menjaga 4 perkara. He says even in an ideal Muslim so-called country, 4 things are protected. And if you cannot get these 4 things, you can actually do it on your own, in your own lives. What are the 4 things? Keamanan jiwa, to be at peace with yourself. That is actually an Islamic country, if you want to use that word. To always be at peace. Kedua, keamanan harta benda, bererti jangan hutang piutang. A country that owes so much from another country is a country that is enslaved. Ketiga, keamanan keturunan. This is also another issue I want to so-called dilate and magnify here, which means that we must ensure that there are generations after us. Which means that, and this is a crisis now in our community, we must encourage our children to get married. We have an issue now all over the world. It's a global issue where young people don't want to get married. In Japan, they get married to dolls. In Korea, they get married to digital devices. This is a crisis. So I really hope, amongst the listeners, if you are serious about setting up a system where Islam is practiced in a natural and in the most effective way, we must ensure that our kids and our friends or whatever, they settle down.
Yes,
right? For those who are listening in here also, you should get married very, very soon. If you cannot get someone, you can contact me. Then the 4th one is keamanan agama, and this is very, very important. That to practice Islam in our homes, in our lives, is to ensure that our beings, our Muslim beings, are at peace with other religions as well, with even people who are secular. A good Muslim is one who is always contributing to mankind. And this is something that I think we need to talk about, especially for us who are minorities in Singapore. We need to be people who are seen by people who are non-Muslims as a contributive force to society. Because if they can see us as people who are at peace with ourselves, people who are nice to other people, people who are always contributing to not only Muslims. Sometimes there is a doctrine amongst people, oh saya cuma nak tolong orang Islam saja. This is a wrong way of looking at this. If we have this idea that we are supposed to be the light that shines to the whole of humankind, then we don't need an Islamic country. What we need is actually people who understand how an Islamic country actually works. Now, I just want to go a little bit, Hamid. When he talks in page 341, he says in the first paragraph, pendeknya, agama Islam adalah agama yang mengatur dan mengurus segala segi dari kegiatan masyarakat, baik hubungan makhluk dengan Tuhannya atau antara makhluk sesama makhluk, sehingga jelaslah tujuan terakhir negara Islam, if there is going to be an Islamic country, yang diagamakan, negara Islam yang diagamakan dan agama dinegarakan, ke bawah kesatuan manusia, ke atas kesatuan Tuhan. Tidak ada hak sesuatu golongan menindas golongan yang lain, dan semua sama di hadapan Tuhan, kerana jiwa seseorang itu harga dengan baktinya. So he's basically trying to emphasize here that if we are serious about showing that Islam is a religion for everyone, we must show that Islam has organized our lives. Now, this is our challenge now as Muslim. We are not able to make our product viable or sellable. Our branding is quite bad to other people because our lives are not settled. And he's trying to say this. He says that the Islamic country that we envision should be an organized country. Now that's really high level and lofty. But for me, the big point here, the Islamic family that we have, the Muslim family that we have, must be an organized family. Because that's where we actually show that justice could be enforced at that level, then it spreads out into society. There's no point to me to have a so-called an Islamic state. I'm against this whole concept of Islamic state totally. My upcoming book actually talks about this issue, that the whole idea of Islamic state didn't even exist during the time of Rasulullah SAW. What Rasulullah SAW was emphasized is an Islamic order where everything that we do follows the systems of Islam. And the systems of Islam need not only come from Muslims, because if non-Muslims can organize a system that protects human lives, that is Islamic. If a non-Muslim can have a country that is clean, that is Islamic. And as Muslims, we should actually try and uphold it first in our lives so that it spreads out in society. Another book I want to recommend, sorry today about a lot of books, because this chapter is such an interesting chapter. This is an old book written by this scholar. I managed to meet his son when I was staying in New York. His name is Muhammad Asad, and Muhammad Asad wrote a very beautiful book in relation to what Hamka is trying to say on state and government in Islam. The title of the book, The Principles of State and Government in Islam. Now, why is it such a beautiful book? He's basically trying to argue in the whole book that the idea of state in Islam, the idea of government in Islam goes all the way down to the level of the individual. That's the first thing. You cannot have a proper Islamic government or Muslim government when the individual cannot govern himself. Right? If you're still taking drugs, if you are still smoking, now we have this new phenomenon. Hamid, I want to talk about this on camera. Somebody sent me a video, a TikTok video. This group of pachi-pachi about my age, nearly late 40s and 50s, main game malam-malam. So they go out midnight playing combat games, computer games. Semua duduk ramai-ramai main game sampai pukul 2-3 pagi baru balik. So this friend of mine shared it on WhatsApp group and said that, oh, this is how you can chill out, nak lepaskan stress. And I was telling the person, this brother should be at home with his wife. He should be with his family, putting his kids to sleep. He should be showing a good example to his children that he's already asleep at 11 o'clock, but he's out there playing games. This is not a distressing, it's actually a very stressful thing to see. Because it shows how we are losing the plot. That we cannot govern ourselves. We are playing games at this age, thinking that this will change the difficult lives that we have. Many studies have shown if you are playing games, especially war games, for a certain extended number of hours, you will get to some kind of addiction, number one. Number two, you will get into some kind of problems of sleeping, right? And the last but not least is the worst of it all, it will affect your social relations, especially your relations with your children and your spouses. The worst part of it, bapa kencing, berdiri, anak kencing, berlari. Malay is a very powerful Malay proverb. Bapa borek, anak rintik. Actually, bapa kencing berdiri, anak kencing berlari, cucu kencing menari-nari kan. But the big point here, if fathers are doing this, what would be of their children? And we have a big issue now in our society of game addiction. Actually, it's a big problem, and we have to handle this and start to have government at home. This is my point here. Rumah tak ada government, so we don't need the government to tell us what to do. We need to start governing ourselves, and this is the point of Muhammad Asad. Muhammad Asad said that the idea of state and government in Islam, the principles of state of government in Islam, first is that the government must be at the level of individual. Second, it has to be at the level of family. But more importantly, the idea of government in Islam is very flexible, that we can learn from other traditions on how to govern ourselves, in as long as it is within the scope of the Quran and the Sunnah.
Yes, thank you, Prof. And I think what Prof just mentioned is a summary of all the past 6-7 sessions. If you go to Prof Khairudin's Instagram page, the few clips that we cut, all the specific topics that Prof has distilled for us about the misconceptions with medicine, about health problems. These are all issues that we have to settle in order to get governance back into the home, and in order to restore justice into the parts that make up the whole. So and Prof, I think this part that you read out on the 4 things, I think these are things that give every Muslim hope in the current age, because we just have to pay attention to these 4 things, and the vistas of knowledge and the light of Islam will spread throughout the world. When it comes to the problems with population, I think Sheikh Abdul Hakim Murad says in 30 years time, the population of Africa will be more than the entirety of Europe, because in Islam we have this celebration of life in marriage and in childbearing. I think when I was in uni, people used to find a problem with marriage talks. Say, why is there so much demand for marriage talks? And then I told them, but what's the opposite of that happening?
People not getting
Yeah,
married.
people so yeah. And then maybe you can move on, Prof.
I just want to fast forward a little bit, Hamid.
Yes, please.
For the lack of time. When Hamka talks about justice, Hamka also talks about injustice. Now, how do we deal with injustice? And many people are even always asking me this question, right? On page 354, he says, jika orang, on the second paragraph, he says, jika orang berlaku jahat kepada kita, the title of the thing is under agama dan kesaktian. Jika orang berlaku jahat kepada kita, kita balas dengan kejahatannya, itu dengan kejahatannya pula. Sepintas lalu dapat dipandang keadilan. Tetapi lebih adil lagi bila tinggi darjatnya kalau orang berbuat jahat kepada kita, kita balas dengan kebaikan. And this is the most difficult thing to do for most people. Orang dah buat jahat dengan kita, apa kita buat? Orang ketuk kita dengan kayu, kita ketuk dia dengan besi. We want to respond evil with evil. And this is not the way of Islam. And we see this actually in many episodes in Islamic history. Again, I just finished the book by John Mann on the life of Salahuddin Al-Ayyubi. And interesting, he's a non-Muslim, and he wrote a book on Salahuddin Al-Ayyubi. And he says that one weakness of Salahuddin Al-Ayyubi is that he was too kind to his enemies. That he was fighting Richard the Lionheart, and he said, well, this guy, he was a younger man than Salahuddin Al-Ayyubi, and he was like bent on beating Salahuddin Al-Ayyubi. And Salahuddin Al-Ayyubi in the end respected him for being a good warrior. When he lost his horses, like Richard the Lionheart, Salahuddin Al-Ayyubi sent him 2 horses so that you can fight better against me. And he was sending even doctors and all to non-Muslims, taking care of them and so forth and so forth. So this is the virtue of Islam, where if you want to fight injustice with injustice, you will develop a whole atmosphere of injustice.
Yes.
Even if our family, sometimes I'm sure some of you face family members behaving in an unjust way towards you. Forgive them and treat them as well as possible. Do not respond to them in a manner that is bad. And more importantly, he's trying to say that kalau membalas dendam kepada kita, kita balas dengan kebaikan, kerana membalas dendam pada hakikatnya mempunyai batas yang tertentu. Kadang-kadang orang yang terlanjur berlaku sewenang-wenangnya melakukan perkara yang jahat kepada kita, terkejut hitam mukanya jika kejahatan kita balas dengan kebaikan. When people treat us wrong in an unjust way and we treat them right, there are a lot of people who will come to their senses and realize the beauty of behaving in such a good way in Islam. One philosopher by the name of Friedrich Nietzsche, he's a German philosopher. He put it very, very powerfully. He says, however you have an enemy, then do not respond his evil with evil. He says respond evil with good, for that would put your enemy to shame. Prove to him that in his evil he has done some good for you. And this is actually a lot of things that he's saying here, Friedrich Nietzsche, is so applicable to Islam. Berbaik-baiklah kepada orang yang berlaku jahat dengan kita. Lebih-lebih lagi bila dia ni keluarga kita. Berapa pun dia buat jahat dengan kita pun, kita selalu balas dengan kebaikan dan mendoakan mereka. Boleh buat tak, Hamid?
InsyaAllah.
Inilah paling susah. Lebih-lebih lagi kalau kita dah bergaduh dengan orang yang kita sangat kenal. Sampai akhirat pun tak boleh ampunkan.
Betul. Yes, Prof. Thank you. And maybe coming to the end of the chapter, as we wrap up this session, then Hamka ask the question, bagaimana supaya kita merdeka? Kemerdekaan adalah nama lain keadilan. So here he's saying freedom is a synonym of of justice. So then he says, how do we achieve this? Apakah erti kemerdekaan? Kemerdekaan ialah bahawa engkau rasai dan dengan perasaan yang jernih hak yang perlu engkau ketahui, dan waktu itu engkau rasai apa pula kewajipan engkau kepada orang lain. Engkau merdeka dan bebas mengembangkan sayap menurutkan kemauan hati untuk membuktikan bahawa engkau berhak. Okay, so it's a bit abstract here, but then he tells us a few things to take care of. Pendidikan budi, pendidikan akal, and perlebarlah lapangan perjuangan. Okay, a bit
Yeah,
abstract
so
here.
he wants to end this chapter again emphasizing that we must always be free from things that take away justice, the idea of justice in ourselves. Now, he says that, and this is in page 369, belumlah, the last paragraph, belumlah dapat diterima kemerdekaan lantaran kita telah pandai menyatakan pendirian dan sanggup pula menanggung jawab sehingga berani berkorban. Itu sebelum sempurna kalau kita belum mengakui orang lain merdeka pula menyatakan pendiriannya walaupun berlawanan dengan perasaan kita dan tidak benar menurut keyakinan dan pertimbangan kita. He says that you cannot see yourself as someone who is free and who can uphold justice unless you have a few traits. Number one, you are open-minded. You stand to be corrected. And for people who are married, that's the hardest, especially when your wife is correcting you. That is the hardest thing to accept. Kerana apa? Kerana lelaki ni ego, right? But more importantly, he's saying that this is actually a struggle. It requires sacrifice. It requires an open heart. Kita panggil dalam bahasa Melayu, berlapang dada. And it requires the understanding that one is not free unless one is free enough to accept the criticisms of others. And something that we need to again change in our culture. Ada orang they have this culture of they don't want to be criticized, right? Especially when they are fathers and husbands, and especially when they are in positions of power, right? They don't want to be criticized, and when they don't want to be criticized, they think by being above criticisms, they actually become more powerful. Actually, it's the reverse. Hamka is trying to say that when you are not able to be criticized or to accept criticism, you actually have put yourself in clutches where you become blind to the realities on the ground. That's why states fall. If you study the story of states, right, the evolution of states, most states fall when the leaders refuse to accept the feedback from the people. And states that last the longest are the states that have good feedback channel. Right? So I just want to finish up by talking about this part where he talks about perempuan. Again, link up to I said that men must be able to accept criticism from women, right? And this is the hardest thing, especially for men. Now, in the last 3 pages, it seems that Hamka is criticizing women, and this is quite shocking, right? He says, merdeka daripada pengaruh perempuan. He says, orang yang dipengaruhi perempuan, yang memandang perempuan hanya satu-satunya kemenangan di dunia, alamat kemerdekaannya telah hilang. So he's almost trying to say that, we must be free from the clutches of women. That's not what he's trying to say. What he's trying to say is that there is a group of men whom in their lives women are everything, right? And the chase for women is the thing that directs their entire life. And he says this is very, very problematic because in an earlier chapter, as we discussed before, men who subject themselves to the will of evil women end up becoming more evil themselves, right? And he's trying to remind men again during his time. I think he's also reminding us during our time also. A lot of men fall because of women, right? And a lot of men also become successful because of women. So we need to understand this in context. We need to understand also when you read the tafsir Al-Azhar, the tafsir of Hamka, he actually discussed so many exemplary women during his time. And one exemplary woman is Asya, the wife of Fir'aun, whom even under a tyrant, she maintained her sanctity and her commitment to Allah. And more importantly, again, I would like all of the listeners to read Surah At-Tahrim. Surah At-Tahrim, a beautiful surah in the Quran where Allah tells the story of Rasulullah SAW and his relationship with his wife. But the surah ends with a beautiful ayat about this woman who is an embodiment of justice, who is an embodiment of freedom, who is an embodiment of piety. And the name of this woman is Maryam. So there is a surah called Surah Maryam, but this surah ends with Maryam, the story of Maryam. Wa Maryam ibnata Imran allati ahsanat farjaha fanafakhna fihi min ruhina wa sadaqat bi kalimati rabbiha wa kutubihi wa kanat minal qanitin. So the last one is very beautiful, where Allah calls Maryam as the person who is most devout and the most upright. So we need to understand that in our bid to attain justice, we need to have our spouse with us in doing it. We need to have our other half. We need to have the women in our families, our mothers, our sisters and others. And we need women in society to help us achieve this idea of justice that we want to enforce in our society.
And thank you so much, Prof. I think we can close the chapter there, inshallah. The next session will be our final one, and inshallah we will cover persahabatan again, where there's also a discussion on women, and then we will end with the chapter on Islam pembentuk pandangan hidup. That should be a good one, inshallah. And with that, see you all in the next one, inshallah. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.